tasked us with identifying some strategies and guidelines for council and committee chairs as far as the notion of essential versus non-essential based on the governor's orders, order number 16. And so thank you, Councilmember Murphy, for putting together this letter. And why don't we just take the ideas that are presented here and go through them. I like the opening. His opening paragraphs are good. We even have Merriam-Webster. Let's see. Oh, I guess I'm trying to click the forward button on this document. I don't guess I can do that on my screen. Stephanie, since you're the host, are you in control of the document?
Yes, sir. If you need me to scroll forward, just let me know.
I think this any comments on the first 2 pages here, or are we ready to move into some of the potential suggestions, guidelines?
Mr. Chair, it looks like Councilmember Rosenberg is in. If he is indeed Dave,
Oh, excellent. Yes, I see. Looks like he's joined from his phone. Councilmember Rosenberg, if you can hear us, let us know.
Yeah, Dave, I don't know if we have to unmute him as a caller or what. I'm not hearing all of him.
Stephanie, as host, do you have any other special powers? There he is. He is now a panelist.
Hey, I can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Welcome. Appreciate it.
Oh, we hear you.
Jeff, if we find any grammatical errors, are we kind of discussing that now, or is it going to go to Attorney Cooper or someone to fix those?
So the draft document that you're looking at came from Councilmember Murphy. We collaborated a bit yesterday, and I have noticed a few other things that I was going to change. So if you see such errors, just let me know, and I'll make sure they get fixed.
Yeah, I've also found a spot or two where a word got deleted as we were editing, and so John, if you'll catch those before, like when we finalize everything, that would be spectacular.
Will do.
Paragraph 4. Go ahead, Freddie.
I was kind of, from my standpoint, maybe the goal is, and I'll vet this with the chair, is, I know Councilmember has spent some time on this, and I believe Mr. Cooper has spent some time on this side of it. I think our goal ought to be to look at, does this letter require substantive changes prior to the executive committee, and then we kind of, accept another potential round of edits and submit it to Mr. Cooper, and ideally get this out to, provided the executive committee have to get this out to the entire body sometime before stuff.
I would like us to spend just a little time discussing what we believe the scope of this committee should be doing. I know we've got, I guess, okay. Sorry for the feedback there. I've got Merriam-Webster definition here of essential versus not essential. Is that really the scope? How are we to define what essential or non-essential is?
how we got here, and then goes into the research and guidance that I found from other cities and other places. So that is the general layout of this letter for the benefit of those who are not familiar with this type of memo.
Okay, thank you. Purposes of discussion, John, we were tasked with interpreting, I guess, if you will, the governor's executive order. It was obviously doesn't have a lot of specificity in regards to allowing local municipalities to craft their own way forward through all this until we can get back to normal. We want to operate as much in normal as possible. I'm not too sure. Well, why don't we go through some of the recommendations, I guess, and we unless anybody else has an idea for a path forward, but maybe we just take the suggested recommendations and.
Councilman Syracuse, I'm connected through the app now. I apologize about the feedback that happened when my app connected and I was still on the phone. I had to connect it through the app now. I do think that will be a good idea if we can go ahead and jump down to the recommendations. I believe at this point everyone should have had the opportunity to read through that first page. I do want to note for the viewing audience who may be listening in and not be able to see the document, that it does specifically state in the letter that these are only suggestions for this period of time while we're meeting in person. So I think that is, thank you so much for adding that, Councilwoman Murphy. I think that's really important for transparency that we are disclosing that this is not, anything permanent. This is just how can we best do our due diligence to operate during this limited period of time, and also that this is only a suggestion and that, ultimately the council is not bound by this, but this is what the recommendation is.
Very good. Agreed. Well said.
I think that's with Stephanie. We have the capability, right? But now that this is on the screen, right? Presumably, Metro Nashville Network will capture this and what is on the screen will be reported as well.
No, what they have is a PowerPoint that will display just saying what committee is talking at this time. So there is we'll have to kind of, as you go through the document, talk through it a little bit just for the listening audience.
I see. Okay, so the presentation that is on WebEx does not actually, there's no syncing with the audio for what we're seeing on the screen right now.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, good to know. Thank you, Freddie.
Yeah, that is very good to know. That's probably important for us to know for council meetings too. Okay, well, so from that perspective, I think I would follow up on what Councilmember Porterfield said there, and just in looking at what is here, right? We kind of, I guess, Mr. Chair, I think of this to some extent as one of the goals I had when we had our executive committee meeting and volunteering to participate in this effort was, really twofold. We want, I think, a statement of principle that we have considered the governor's executive order and we have thought about how its local application would play out, right? And that I think that's important both for members, right? I think that's important for our council. I think it's also important for the general public to know and understand that as a body, not only does our executive committee, made up of chairs, right, who are governing their committees, but the entire council has at least had the opportunity to consider these things, and that that everyone should be able to rest assured that we are not abusing Executive Order number 16 to operate under cover of darkness, right? And that we are, in fact, committing to a process of transparency and urgency as best we can, so that frivolous matters are subject to greater scrutiny. I think that's kind of the spirit of this letter, and I think Councilmember Porterfield alluded to this. This letter itself does not have any order effect on the body in the way that the governor's stay-home order does, right? Like this does not have a required language, and even if it did, I mean, Mr. Cooper can step in here, but there is literally no binding effect that distributing this letter has.
Correct. Neither the letter nor any subsequent action that the executive committee took would have any binding effect on the council. It's just guidance.
So in light of that, I feel pretty good about the sort of structural layout that Councilmember Murphy reviewed here in terms of how the overall document is structured. I guess one thing I would say though, John, is at least for the purposes of this draft, this says, "Dear Executive Committee," if in fact the Executive Committee endorses distribution to the body, I think we would ultimately want that to be along the lines of a "Dear colleagues" or "Dear council members."
Yeah, I think the intention was that this go to the executive committee, which is made up primarily of the committee chairs, and then the committee chairs could inform the committees of this letter. And then if the executive committee meets again next week and wants to bless it or whatever, then they could at that point, and it could be changed.
Okay, well, that might be worth discussing too, as sort of a sequence of orderly steps here. I guess I came in today under the assumption that we would chew on this, whatever this subcommittee digested would then be transmitted to the executive committee with the intent of, they're submitting edits. I don't know if the vice mayor or executive committee members have a clear understanding of what we might do again. I guess, again, my thinking was that we would ideally have this together for the body as guidance before our next council meeting. So that was kind of the sequence of steps I was looking for.
I agree with Councilman.
I don't know that the executive. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I really thought that we were at a point where we'd be able to get moving on this, get it to the executive committee to discuss and get it done, so we're not kind of, wandering through the wilderness again on Tuesday with another batch of legislation that may or not, the idea, I think, was for us to be able to use electronic meetings to handle legislation that couldn't reasonably be delayed. I know that was language that was bouncing around at one point up when the legislature was in session, and certainly guided Governor Lee. And I feel like we should be able to, get to a point, I would think today, where it could get to the executive committee for discussion on Monday and get moving on this. Just very frustrated with the speed at which everything is moving right now.
Well, or even to get to them by tomorrow with feedback to come into the council. I could be wrong, John, but I'm not. I guess if we feel pretty good about this as a subcommittee, I think the people who have participated to participate in this subcommittee is enough document. So, even if we had one person disagree, or frankly, even a narrow majority support the letter, I think that's kind of how this works, right? And so
if people wanted to come back with suggested edits, they could submit those to the council office. I don't personally feel strongly that the executive committee needs to meet in order to consider the letter, but I do want to bring the letter to their attention and invite feedback. But I would hope that we could turn around just before committees on Monday, but that's just one member's opinion.
I do want to give something to Vice Mayor and the executive committee, as we were tasked to do. I didn't think that last Tuesday was all that bad. We didn't spend an inordinate amount of extra time, I thought, because of the limitations that we had. Obviously, we deferred all public hearing because we're not prepared to handle that. Based on that, do we want to jump into some of the specific recommendations here? I don't know if you've all had a chance to look through this and have other potential suggestions, recommendations.
Just if I may, real quick,
Please.
I feel, we've punted a lot of the legislation that's going to require real debate and a lot of complex voting and that sort of thing. So I think, even if not all that bad is the standard we're reaching for, I think that is only going to carry us so long until we come up with real solutions for when we have to have real debate and high numbers of votes, like the budget, where we're going to need to have, potentially 15 roll call votes like we usually do on amendments. That's not part of this essential conversation that we're having right now, but it is an important thing that needs to be moved forward by the executive committee as soon as is practicably possible.
Yes, I agree totally. I guess I was just referring to being at the first meeting that we had electronically. I didn't think it necessarily, it didn't blow up, didn't fall off the rails. But you're absolutely right that we are not operating with full capability to handle public hearings and whatnot yet. I do know ITS is working very hard on that and should have a solid update to us very soon. Do we want to jump into the suggestions and recommendations here?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And Chair, just one other quick comment on that is I would say, part of what we're doing, I think, first as a subcommittee and then ultimately as an executive committee and council is, just as the mayor is doing literally daily briefings right now for the media, ostensibly for the benefit of the general public. This is kind of to me, the legislative step of offering a vote of confidence to the general public, right? I think that's kind of what this letter represents, is that, we are taking a twofold approach to this, right? One is we are demonstrating how we are interpreting our ability to govern under Executive Order 16 conceptually through this letter. And then separately, we're working closely with ITS to ensure that we literally have the capability to govern. And I think both of those are important public confidence measures.
Indeed. Okay. First recommendation here is basically that it's a diametric statement, if you will, that essential legislation should be considered by council and non-essential legislation should be deferred. This is where it's difficult in this context in saying essential should go forward, non-essential should be deferred. How do we define that? I'm not sure this needs to be there.
I think the purpose of our subcommittee was what is essential and not essential. And if you read under A, it goes down to explain kind of litmus tests, if you want to call them litmus tests, where I came up with this guidance and suggestions, and also ways for if something might not, pass the test completely, how a council member or an applicant can still move forward. So I think while A says essential legislation should be considered by the council, non-essential legislation should be deferred, that is the title of it, but under that is the suggestions and guidelines that the council should be using. So it's unfortunate that the page just cut off that way, but I think you should continue reading.
I'll jump in here. I do like that under that first section, it talks about the executive committee should encourage council members, departments, and applicants in keeping with the spirit of the council's Rule 13 questions on late filed legislation, resolutions, and amendments. If legislation is not urgently needed or is emergency legislation, and if the legislation can wait until we meet in person, then it should be deferred until then. I do like that it is, basically asking the non-urgent and non-essential legislation can still be filed but deferred until we meet in person. So I like that it does give the option to still file the legislation. I think the questions that are being asked here are meaningful questions, and I think that is a good way to help guide council members on whether or not this is something that needs to be addressed at this time or something that needs to be delayed. I think it is very important that we move forward with the business of the city. And I think that we don't want to be so backed up that when we meet in person, that we're having council meetings that are going to, 2 a.m. But I also think that it's really important that we are operating with the confidence of the public and the viewing audience, and so that people don't feel like we're just pushing through a lot of legislation when it is more difficult for them to participate. So I think the questions A through F that Councilwoman Murphy included are just really solid questions with helping council members determine whether or not this is essential or if it's something that should potentially be deferred, with the caveat that was already stated that council members can choose to do this or not. If somebody has legislation that they want to move forward with, they can, but this just gives the opportunity for them to stop and think about the legislation that they're doing to determine if it needs to go forward at this time or if it should wait.
I can't agree with Councilmember Porterfield more here. Again, in keeping with the idea that this is sort of guidance and a statement of principle, noting that we have another jurisdiction that can kind of serve as a reference standard, I feel like giving members the confidence that if they are getting external pressure to run a bill for a given interest, that it is important that we offer them a way to kind of say, that we've considered this. And so, hey, happy to run your bill. I'll say this. There are some policies that I was hoping to work on.
Brady, we lost you.
That I was ordinarily able to pursue. And I know that, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Am I back yet? Sorry about that. I can point to this as exactly why later when I've got people that are also interested in seeing me pursue those policies. It's nice to have a point in time to say, look, council really thought about this hard, and the guidance we decided to lean on was expressly, we recognize this is a crisis, and a crisis is not a time when we should put further pressure on already somewhat tenuous trust in Metro that has not been fully restored, honestly, since the collapse of a mayoral administration and scandal.
I agree also, and I think there's legislation that's really important to me that I would love to see move forward that just does not meet this, does not meet the standard, I don't think, during an emergency like this, where we can't be face to face with the people that we represent, where we're our debate is not, it's not nearly as an effective debate under the best scenario for electronic meetings. It's, not the same. And I think that we need to, even though some people would be inclined to put off their legislation to honor that kind of position, I think that we need to have consistency across the body when it comes to that sort of thing. So I agree with what Freddie and Delisha just said.
Very good. So are we cool then to keep I in section AI, I guess, or A1, whatever. And does anybody have any issues with the statement there about memorializing and congratulatory resolutions? I think those are fairly pragmatic things.
Mr. Chair, I think AI is really good, both 1 and 2. If you want to suggest some language for the kind of prefatory statement here, I would consider that, right? Like I don't want to be like so hardline that people misinterpret this, but I take your point about, like we're not trying to drop a hammer so much as we are trying to provide some guidance to folks.
I agree, Councilman O'Connell. I think that we can soften the language of A. That can, I didn't think of it from that perspective, but that can be a bit of a turnoff. That opening statement being so hard could be a bit of a turnoff, and it may then, I guess people could then misinterpret the spirit of the rest of the letter. So I think that that those two sentences may need to be massaged a little bit. I highlighted it on my end. I'll think of some language to soften it, and if anyone else has any, I think that would be a good idea.
John.
Mr. Chair, for purposes of the listening audience, I would suggest actually reading the bolded part under number 2 there, since that's the kind of the bulk of the recommendations. I think if that part was read into the record, that would be helpful.
Sure, I'll do that. So it quotes the Arlington County, Virginia, I guess their legislative body there, where they had public meeting and gatherings guidance to mitigate and contain the spread of COVID-19. And this was published on March 12th. And again, thank you, Councilmember Murphy. This was a good find. So the questions that they presented to determine whether or not legislation is essential and should be acted on at this time, or if it should be deferred. First question is, does the legislation have a statutory time requirement? Second question is the legislation time sensitive or required for an existing essential business to continue? Third question, would deferring the legislation cause an undue hardship on critical programs or services? Next is, would deferring the legislation potentially jeopardize funding for the metropolitan government? Next one is, have Nashvillians directly affected or impacted by this legislation been able to have input or have access to adequate methods for being engaged and providing input? And the final question is, would this legislation put Nashvillians at risk of not being socially distant to reduce risk of exposure? So all very good questions. Well done, Arlington. Thank you for your guidance for our guidance committee. Anybody have any further input on that? But I think that does help us frame where we're headed. John, is your hand still up? All right, okay. All right, anything there? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section that talks about memorializing and congratulatory resolutions. Whether or not that they should be filed. Oh, go ahead. Somebody.
So this is Porterfield. My interpretation of this section was basically that if it is something that is date specific, then let it be filed. And if it's something that is not, then it can be held. So for example, if there was something for Earth Day that had a specific date, then file that resolution. But if it's something, this marks the 100-year anniversary for women's suffrage, if that's not a specific date, if that's something that's being honored all year, then we can hold off and file that towards the end of the year when we're meeting back in public. I think that is a very wise move. I appreciate you for adding that, Councilwoman Murphy.
I like it too. The only word that I might suggest we change is it says, obviously it says, so yes, for folks listening, I'll kind of summarize this. It says memorializing and congratulatory resolutions and the like should not be filed unless they are date specific, just like Councilmember Porterfield alluded to with Earth Day. Makes total sense. Stuff you can't wait on has to go forward. Pieces of legislation with no date that are not date specific should be deferred. And then I do like the suggestion here. This is where my suggested change is. When we are meeting in person again, Council Rule 12 should be suspended at that time to remove the limits on the number of memorializing resolutions a council member can file. Maybe we just could change the word should to could. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do that, but it's something as we get back into normal times. I think the intent here is that if a council member had to wait or chose to wait on a memorializing resolution and they had a few that were backed up, well, we could give them the flexibility to be able to file more than the allotted number.
I like that change, Jeff. I would also say the next sentence where it says council members should be flexible and understanding if we need to break them up among council agendas when we start meeting again. I think that kind of under that same thought, that could be something along the lines of we would ask council members to be more flexible as opposed to should.
Good. Any other thoughts on that, or otherwise?
Should we be taking notes of these changes that we're suggesting, or is someone taking notes of this?
John, are you?
I just started taking notes when you started suggesting changes to the language.
Very good.
So I'm making edits on the fly.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
I made some notes as well. DP, gotcha.
Thank you.
So the next section talks about easements and alley abandonment or acceptances, aerial encroachments, and routine mandatory referral legislation. The suggestion here is that each legislation should be accompanied by a letter from the applicable Metro Department and the applicants explaining why the legislation is urgent or time sensitive and essential. In thinking about this, is that placing an administrative burden on every single piece of alley abandonment, easement abandonment, acceptance, encroachment? Is that adding more administration to council staff? What are your thoughts on that? I'd like to see most of these go forward. I think a lot of times encroachments, abandonments, acceptances are seemingly a small piece legislatively, but are important to keeping large projects, or of any size projects that are important to that district council member, I'm sure, that they not be delayed.
Are these typically on consent agenda, Councilman Syracuse?
A lot of times they are, unless they're pulled off.
Is this likely to be controversial? Are easements typically controversial?
They generally are not. They can be, but they are, I experience anyway.
And forgive me for those questions. I'm still kind of new, so I don't always know the answer, so please forgive me. But could there be something could this be something that we're asking for if it is controversial? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you won't know if it's controversial or not until you actually get into get into the meeting.
Well, here's how I've been thinking about it, Mr. Chair. You know, the way I've thought about this is the linkage between the guidance we're providing in this letter and where essential activities are otherwise defined by our local safer at home order or state executive orders, right? And so, you know, from that standpoint, I think I would look at it and say, if there is a business that was pursuing an aerial or underground encroachment or, you know, easement or abandonment or acceptance or whatever, that was a business that was literally not supposed to be operating right now, I would probably look to defer that, right? You know, as opposed to, let's say, a grocery store or new market or something like that, we're opening right now and wanted a sign. I mean, I think that's kind of where I think this letter is ideally trying to target things. So I don't know, maybe there is some way to rework item 3 here so that it is more about helping characterize. Well, I guess that's what 1 and 2 do. As I look at it, the examples here, I think, are maybe the most instructive part. And maybe the guidance on a letter, especially because this is non-binding. I mean, this kind of gets back into those things that you might not have an ability to enforce, because, you know, if metro departments decide they don't want to comply with this, you know, we're not in a position to do that. But I think maybe what we could say is, you know, something, maybe we tune that main language of item 3 up to say members should consider requesting letters from the applicable metro department, right? Because I think that is something that can be done before something is moved, rather than it being you know, a broad statement of all of these must have a letter.
I think, Freddie, that's the nail on the head here that I was trying to get at. And again, when coming up with these examples, I was trying to think of past legislation that's come before us and some things, and you hit it completely on. If it's a business that is closed right now, like then let's not move forward with it. If it's a project of an aerial encroachment or an underground encroachment where people are going to be digging close together, then they're not going to be socially distancing and we're putting them at risk. And so I think these examples kind of clarified that. And I will say that in my district, I have had controversial easements and abandonments and things like that. And quite frankly, I've also had abandonments and easements that come to me with no explanation of why they're needed and why they're not needed. And I've held them up personally to figure out, like, is this something? And I think we've heard Council Lady Henderson talk about this in Public Works Committee, is like the fact that Metro has given up easements or abandonments kind of without explanation in the past. Yeah. And that has come back to hurt us when we talk about greenways and sidewalks. Now, obviously, getting back to our point here of essential legislation, I think, and this is something I've been doing in the planning committee, is I want to hear from the district council person of if something needs to move forward. And so I think it's totally acceptable to ask the applicant or the department, not just like why this is essential, but like why is it needed anytime. But I think this, of all times, they should explain why it's essential or needed right now. Obviously the back tax things that we're like selling on the courthouse steps, that's different. That's revenue that we can come in and that's easy peasy. But some of these one-offs, those are things that we might want to look at harder. And at the end of the day, they could always be on a consent agenda when we start meeting again and have more time to look at it. But we have more information behind if they need to happen or not.
I hear you on that. I think the reason I'm suggesting maybe a slight restructure of that language is that I think individual district members or committee chairs could request that. This letter is certainly not going to require that, right? And so I think maybe if we put the guidance such that the empowerment factor exists for, you know, you as chair of planning, Angie as chair of public works, you know, anybody else that might wind up having such an item come before their committee, or any members that might be carrying such an item, yeah, that if they are encouraged to make that request, I think that's actually better from a how this would actually play out in governance standpoint than just having this letter assert that this should be the case.
I agree, Freddie. And I think you said something a second ago, right before Councilmember Murphy started speaking, that just kind of made me think about something. If we're pretty much outlining in the very first section, Section A, Part 2, AI2, I guess it is, the questions to determine if legislation is essential or if it should be deferred, my thought would be, do we need a separate section for easements and alley abandonments, or are we putting the onus on whoever is bringing forth that legislation to go through those questions and determine if it is essential, and if they want to get information, you know, from the department head, like let them work it out with the department head as to whether or not this is essential, and then bring that back to the council, as opposed to having it laid out in a separate section, since we already have the guidance in Part 2 above. I'm wondering if this section is needed, or if it's kind of covered in with the questions above. That's the short version of what I'm thinking.
Oh, that's an idea, that you could maybe merge 3 somehow into one. Because most of the time, these are resolutions. I think underground encroachments, if I'm not mistaken, actually run as 3 reading ordinances. So, but I see what you're saying. If we did that, then I would want to keep those examples intact as maybe an item 3 under Section I. But I could live with that. I do think there is something to encouraging chairs and members, though, to look at the urgent and time-sensitive nature and still like have an explanation from either the department or the applicant as appropriate. Right? I think that explicit encouragement, even as an expectation, is reasonable. I just don't want this. I think maybe structurally having this letter be the thing that asserts that is a, you know, kind of a requirement is maybe that stepping that down to something that, you know, I know Councilmember Syracuse was looking at item A altogether from that standpoint. I think if we change that language to kind of make it a member guidance rather than a guidance to departments, it strengthens the outcome.
I agree. Mr. Cooper, you have a suggestion?
Yes, I was just going to, in that section, I'm making some suggested edits here to that subparagraph 3 to say, for easement, alley abandonment, acceptances, aerial encroachments, and routine mandatory referral legislation, sponsors should consider requesting a letter from the applicable Metro Department and/or the applicants explaining why the legislation is urgent, so that it's more of a suggestion to council members that they reach out to the departments or applicants and get such justification.
I'm all for that.
I am as well.
Cooper, I like the way that you phrase that. That's much more elegantly, as I can't even say that, than I have it. My only, as we're switching burden of letter, my only concern is that council already has a lot of burdens. And so that's where I thought, you know, the applicant and the department should provide it, but I am totally fine with shifting that burden over to the councilman should be requesting and requiring. Requesting or requiring.
And Councilmember Murphy, I think along those lines, one of the reasons I'm actually comfortable doing that is I think that also, to me at least, as an individual district member, that reinforces to me the sense that this is an unprecedented moment in governance, and maybe I should be more careful about I need to be considering everything that I'm running, either for the administration or for myself, right? So that I don't mind that burden being on chairs and members.
I agree, Freddie. Thank you.
Good deal. Thank you, John. Excellent edits. There's no other suggestions for section A3. We will move on. Councilmember Porterfield, did you have something?
Nope.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so we're on the next section. That was section A. This is now section B, which talks about committee meetings. I'm of the opinion that the first item here, where it talks about we are not making a recommendation at this time as to whether committees should be consolidated, I'd be fine with removing that altogether. It's okay to leave it in there, but I do think that
of the letter, I agree, Jeff.
Folks who are chairs of their respective committees, and as we talked about, what are we managing to here? We don't yet know the we don't know.
I like striking B item 1. I'm for that.
Is everybody okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I like that part 2 is asking that the committee meetings be split and staggered so that the committees don't overlap. I think that, as we saw today, technical difficulties do happen at times. And I think that having the committee meetings too closely together can provide an issue for someone who may be in 2 committees that are meeting at very close times. So I'm for striking part 1, and I support part 2.
Very good. If everybody's okay with striking B1, which talks about we are not making recommendation at this time as to whether committees should be consolidated. It was worthy of discussion, perhaps, but I don't think it's necessary. So to Councilmember Porterfield's point about number 2 states, to the greatest extent possible, committee meetings should be split between 2 days and staggered so that no committees overlap each other. This is good pragmatic administration, really. I think, as Councilmember O'Connell found last Tuesday, trying to be in 2 committees meetings at the same time, planning and public works, was virtually, not just physically, but virtually almost impossible.
It was slightly easier than doing it physically.
Yeah. So this is where the request is of our clerk and our council staff. Obviously we have budget and finance and planning that usually happens on Monday with affordable housing on Mondays, and generally then the rest of the committees are on Tuesday. However, clerk staff can ensure that meetings don't overlap. Obviously, perhaps this is where language could be added to remind council members that, or chairs rather, as you're leading your committees, try not to, try to be as efficient as possible. I don't know. There could be some additional language here, perhaps, as to why we're saying that to the greatest extent possible, committee meetings should be split between 2 days and staggered so that no committees overlap each other. But if everybody's okay with just that one sentence, we'll keep it and move on.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
if I can interject, I worked with the clerk for the committee schedule for next week so that there are no overlapping committees. And in fact, for purposes of streaming on the Metro Nashville network, the committees will flow consecutively. So one will not be able to start until the preceding one finishes. So I think the Vice Mayor is going to encourage chairs to be mindful of those time constraints so that we can end up starting the council meeting on time.
Excellent. Okay. That's good.
Do we need to have that in there, Attorney Cooper, since that's already being addressed? Should it be removed or is it still needed?
That's up to you. I think it certainly is a good reminder.
Yeah, I would agree to keep it in there. If John, based on how you all are helping to craft how this is going to go next Monday and Tuesday, is there anything additional here to remind us all?
I do think a statement about keeping within the time confines allotted would be helpful, but that's up to the subcommittee.
Is everyone okay with Mr. Cooper taking a crack at adding maybe one sentence to that regard?
Works for me.
Very good. Thank you, John. Again, B3. If one committee desires for further discussion on legislation, that committee can defer it to the next meeting without re-referring to all committees. Committees should be respectful of other committees' requests for deferrals. I'm of the same opinion as B1 on this one. Unless we're managing to something that's going to be a bigger issue, I don't know if this is needed. I understand the thought.
I think this is in here because a lot of discussion has happened about committee agendas are getting bogged down because one committee wants to continue to discuss something. One committee may be done with discussing something and already made its recommendation, yet it continues to come back to that committee's agenda. And so if one committee has voted it out and is done with discussion and does not desire to bring it back to their committee, it should be moved out. If one committee wants to continue to discuss, they can keep it in their committee.
Is this within the scope of what this exercise is?
Yes, because I feel like it is a legislation that has passed through the planning committee to continue to come back to the planning committee. It's not essential to come back to the planning committee if we've already made a recommendation. If Public Works wants to continue to discuss something, that's fine, but it is not needed to come back to planning after we've made a recommendation unless we requested that.
All right. Any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, we'll move on with committee agendas should be shown on the screen of WebEx. Absolutely. So B4, committee agendas should be shown on the screen of WebEx. Ideally, just like this letter, as we're seeing on WebEx, it would be great as we follow the screen there that the agenda would be on there. That's obviously in regards to if the ability to do so is there. Obviously, we're seeing this, but is the public seeing what we're seeing? I think that's well. We'll get to that in regards to public hearings or whatnot. Any other comment on that one? Otherwise, we'll move on. C.
I think you hinted at this, Matt.
What's that? Let's go ahead. Sorry, Councilman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I think it's imperative that we move to something that allows the public at large to see what we are seeing. I'm surprised to learn today that audio and display are not synced up here for the purposes of MNN. So I think I know Mr. Rose was going to follow up with Mr. Durbin about some ITS issues. So I'm hoping that that is something we can resolve quickly. Obviously, we might not have it by Monday or Tuesday, but that is something that if that is a limitation at WebEx in terms of how this gets recorded for posterity or is viewed live by folks, it's something we need to work on.
I agree. Okay, moving on to C, just interfacing with the public and community engagement. So this is really important. So C1 states that the council office should send the contents, well, this one here about C1 is the council office should send the contents of council member mailboxes to each council member's home address. I am of the opinion that council members can go in to the council office to get their mail. I don't know how much time we want to spend on this one, but Councilmember O'Connell, do you have a comment on this one?
I mean, I don't feel strongly about this. I just know that we don't have desks right now, right? And I know that for some members, it might be easier to do that. I know some members are justifiably anxious to
Could we possibly?
I have not. I mean, this may be worth asking.
Could we?
This was something that was brought to me, mentioned to me by other council members. So, because the concern is that we might be missing BZA letters, we might be missing letters from constituents since our addresses are not posted on the website. And so this was a suggestion from a few other council members in general.
I have a question about this, and maybe I just don't get the good stuff, but the things that are on my desk are usually they're not necessary for me to conduct the council business. Like, it's never really anything urgent. Like, it's always invitations to, I don't know, go to events. And right now they're not having events, or flyers or magazine type printings. I don't know. If there's something that's from a department like BZA, or if there's a letter, so I know sometimes we'll get a letter that's like distributed by a council member. Could we request that those letters be just emailed to us, as opposed to them printing letters and then having those letters forwarded to our homes? Could we just get them through email?
John has his hand raised. My suggestion to change this is that maybe the request of council staff to monitor our mailboxes, and they know what comes into our mailboxes. And if something is of importance, timely or whatnot, that they just notify us that it's there. John, go ahead.
Yes, I had a conversation with Roseanne earlier today about this, and our suggestion was that we go in once a week and go through the mailboxes and then mail whatever in our judgment we think is important, because like Councilmember Porterfield said, a lot of it is kind of government junk mail. And so that would be less of an administrative burden, but you could also still get whatever is important that you should have.
I'm okay with that edit if other committee members are.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. I don't want people to be it's the same thing, right? Like, I know we represent the public. I know, to your point, a lot of it is promotional, but I have also received timely correspondence from constituents or organizations that may be equipped to be doing digital correspondence in a fashion. And I'm totally happy to have an edit here that just says we're not going to stuff everything in your mailbox in a fat envelope and mail it out every week, but that if Mr. Cooper says that is a capability of the council office to do this with some discretion, I'm totally comfortable with that.
I'm good with that too. Attorney Cooper, my question would be, since we were thinking every 2 weeks, And Rosie is saying every 1 week. I mean, I would be okay with them just doing that every 2 weeks to lessen their risk of going into the office on a weekly basis.
2 weeks sounds great to me.
Maybe this is one where some council members maybe the council members who are very anxious about their mail, they can request it more often than that. I mean, John, tell us what would work best. I mean, obviously you don't want 40 different requests on mail, but this, again, I'm not married to this thing. This suggestion, it just had come from a number of council members mentioned about how are we going to get our mail. So obviously you don't want 40 of us having 40 different requests of what day we want it sent, but maybe this is something that you just poll us and certain people are okay with it 2 weeks, certain people are okay with it 1 week. I mean, that's one thing I noticed when I got on the planning commission is they do spend $8 every time to mail me my planning packet. And I was like, surely there's a better way to save $8 twice a month. So maybe this is something that we just poll the council members and give them 1 or 2 options or something and handle it that way. Would that work better for y'all and staff?
Well, and just messaged me, none of us are working in the office. We're all working from home except on council meeting weeks. However, Rosie has been going in once a week to check the mail. And so she indicated that weekly she's going to be there checking the mail anyway. And I think we can make it work weekly.
That's good. So mail will be checked weekly. If there's items that need quick attention from council members, Rosie staff will alert us.
Yeah, I think that's good. Although I think there is a separate but nearby conversation about this seems like a great moment for Metro to reduce its printing costs and push more of our operations to a digital posture.
Amen.
I agree with that, Councilman O'Connell, because I'm thinking about, I feel like that's a waste of postage stamps to send me. I do appreciate
Most things I get on Metro letterhead are a waste of either postage or printing.
I agree. I think that we need to push for digital. Although I know that's not in the scope of today's conversation, I do think we need to push for our departments to go more digital when they're sending us something and not print it.
All right. Very good. C2 talks about rather than fully suspending the announcement extraordinary matters period, which happens at 6 p.m. before the 6:30 council meeting, a suggestion is that the ITS should be requested to provide a mechanism for council members to submit public announcements that scroll at the bottom of the live video feed during the meeting. I'm fine with this. I support some method. I don't know if we want to be as specific as asking for something scrolling at the bottom live feed of the meeting, or
yeah, I think we could leave out the mechanic. I don't need that, but I do like the idea of continuing to have community advisories.
Yes.
I'll add in, I don't know where that came from, the scrolling at the bottom. My letter had already had said something to the effect of, it's an attachment that goes out similar to our weekly calendar of events or something like that. I'm worried scrolling at the bottom might be too much. I don't know the right word here because white noise isn't the right word here, but visually clutter with everything else going on. So that's not part of my original suggestion, but I do think we need to have a mechanism for it to be publicized in some way.
Okay, so John, maybe the period at the end of the sentence is to provide a mechanism for council members to submit public announcements, period. Everybody good with that? All right. Okay, C3, ITS should be requested to provide a mechanism for Rule 28, which is the public comment period, to happen virtually by allowing members of the public who follow the registration procedures. I guess if we could move on to the next page, please, Stephanie. Thanks. Guidelines to the rule to upload or ITS capture video. The public could provide a voicemail option. Here again, maybe, but basically what we're asking for is that ITS look into the ability for us to continue to have the opportunity for non-public hearing days for the public to have that public comment period. Everybody good with leaving that in there? Obviously, we're giving some specifics of potentials, but obviously be up to ITS to give us what is possible. Is that good?
I think that's, I mean, this letter and anything else we communicate from this point forward, I think needs to, you know, we have to improve our technological governance capabilities, right? So I think we do want to be expressive of that.
Absolutely. And then C4 in the same realm here, it talks about the executive committee should urge ITS to continue developing and evaluating more appropriate technology solutions for public governance, leaning hard on our relationship with the National League of Cities and our existing contractual arrangements with Granicus. For the public, that is a company that provides tech solutions that Metro has a contract with. ITS must keep in mind and help make available other options to the public that does not, to the public that it says does not have, is that do not, is that a typo? ITS must keep in mind and help make available, and this is very important, other available options to the public, perhaps I should say, who do not have access to technology. And it does say this is being worked on. Yes, we know this is being worked on, but I think it is important to make the statement that we can't continue to push public hearings out each month.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think to this end, I agree with your opening statement for today's meeting that in some ways, I was pleasantly surprised that we were able to conduct key committees and a council meeting, but I also know that it felt more like a one-off than oh yeah, we've hit our stride here kind of situation. And as such, I want to make sure that the public is aware that we are continuing to work on improvements to our governance.
I think it's really important about making sure that members of our city community that don't have access to technology, making sure that they are still have a voice and that they can be engaged. So I do like the idea of asking ITS to find a way for people who may not have access to that technology to make sure that they are being included as well. I'm beginning to think as I'm listening to some of these suggestions and reading through the suggestions, and I think that they're amazing suggestions. I feel like we've kind of taken our letter and we have two different things going on. On one hand, it is we are defining or making a recommendation on what we believe is essential versus non-essential. And then on the other hand, we are making recommendations to how we can, I guess, better govern during this period of time and how meetings can go more efficiently and how we as a council can operate during this unprecedented time. So I'm wondering if this almost needs to be, I don't know if we need two letters or if it needs to be separated out some type of way. One of which is saying, hey, this is the purpose of this committee is essential versus non-essential. And that is what we pretty much dealt with in part A of the letter. And everything else, we're making recommendations on how to govern during this period of time. So I'm wondering, I don't think that it should be, these things should be taken out, but I'm wondering if this needs to be like a second letter with recommendations. I don't know anybody's thoughts on that, but
I feel like it's important. I think this is really good and it's all really important, but I do think that this goes past the scope of what is essential versus non-essential.
I agree with you. That was why I asked the question in the beginning about, we talk about what the scope of our task here is. And I do agree, Councilmember Porterfield, that I think we should have some lessons learned. Like we have made some statements in here that were lessons learned from week one doing this, and what we recommend to go forward. So perhaps I think you're absolutely right. Perhaps the title of this document in our committee that we're defining ourselves perhaps a little bit is not only guidance for council members and committee chairs about what is essential and non-essential, but also suggestions and recommendations for how we move forward to keep our process efficient, effective, and inclusive. Full transparency. That's a long title. I don't know how we retitle this, but I would agree that we probably should.
I think that rather than retitling or recreating our scope and things, I think what this section, what we're trying to get at with some of this is these are things that help us essentially govern. Hearing from the public, we had public comment, and being able to still hear that, I think, is extremely important for transparent and effective essential governance that we are doing virtually. And so I think leaving, rather than, I know that it was suggested at one point we should put in here, remind people to mute themselves. That, yes, a different thing. But this here, where we're talking about ways to interact and still hear from the public, I think that is essential to how we can continue to be a democracy and how we can still govern and represent our constituency and hear from them in the most normal yet unprecedented time. And so I think rather than strike this now, I think we leave it in because we are saying that it is currently being worked on, and another ad hoc subcommittee can take that ball and run with it. But I think it's important to leave in because I think that public comment period is essential to us hearing from the public on matters that are and are not before us.
Agreed.
I agree, Council Lady Murphy. I don't think it should be struck down at all. I actually was thinking about the previous section when we're talking about council staff sending us mail. So I think that's really important, giving us guidance on how we as a body are operating. But I think that is outside of the scope of defining what is essential versus what is non-essential. So I think we've done two separate things. Like we're saying what's essential versus non-essential. And then we're also saying, hey, this is how we're recommending that we operate during this period of time. So I think that these are kind of like operational recommendations as opposed to what legislation is essential and what legislation is not essential. And I think that both of those are important. So I don't think we should strike any of this out. I just think that we need to acknowledge that we're beyond the scope. And if we're going to be beyond the scope, then I just think that should be acknowledged.
Well said. Councilmember O'Connell, did you have something?
Councilmember Porterfield, the only thing I'll say is I think we're not. Yeah. Sorry, I don't think we're necessarily beyond the scope here in the sense that I think this is both internal communication by way of guidance to chairs and members, but it is also public communication by way of expressing to members of the general public that we know it's important when we receive non-digital correspondence through postal mail. We know it's important that there be a process for public engagement. And I think it's for those reasons, I think it's both in scope and worth continuing to include.
I absolutely agree that we should continue to include this. So I don't want to be misconstrued. I think that everything that's in here is important and it should continue to be included. So I don't want my statements to be construed as saying we need to strike these sections or remove them. I think that they are all important sections.
I'm right there with you. I think you said it well. We're just kind of defining the scope of what this special subcommittee is going to present, which is, yeah, so well said. So that's probably a good segue to move on to the last section, which is possibly the most important one in regards to zoning legislation and public hearings, something we haven't been able to do yet. And hopefully at the May 7th meeting, we will. So there's two parts to section D here called zoning legislation and public hearings. The first one is council should hold itself to transparency and allow for as much public input on zoning legislation as possible. One way to do this is not move legislation forward until it has been heard and has a recommendation from the Planning Commission, even after the 60-day provision. Is this, again, within the scope of what we are doing here, or is this more of a broader topic? Does anybody have a thought on that?
Well, as planning chair, I have and I've said this since I volunteered to run for planning chair, is that I feel I have two hats. One hat is to be the representative of the council to the commission, and the other hat is to be representative of the commission to the council at times. And I think that we might get into some tricky, loopholes isn't the right situation. Maybe sand traps is better, where legislation can move forward at the council because the commission hasn't heard it. And one of the things that I think we all pride ourselves on, and I've heard many council members over the last 5 years, this term and last, say, is if you have concerns about zoning legislation, you have 2 bites at the apple for public hearing. And I think that if we move forward with public hearing at council before we get policy recommendations and the input at the Planning Commission hearing, I think we're doing a disservice to the very constituents we represent. And I have really seen that firsthand being at the Planning Commission now. And so I really feel that, something has to move forward. I mean, again, this is guidelines and these are suggestions, but I really think that to be fair and transparent and to proceed forward with the best zoning legislation possible, we need to have that public hearing and policy discussion at the Planning Commission and then at the council. Because as we all know, I would probably say at least 7 or 8 out of 10 pieces of legislation, you get feedback at the Planning Commission and then it comes to council and it has improvements. And even though you can amend it on third, I still feel it is very essential to the overall process that has been, basically set in stone for, John Cooper can tell me how long, I'm not going to say eternity, but all of Metro, for Metro's history, is that it goes to the Planning Commission and then it comes to us. And I think that's just a very, a tradition that we need to keep in order. Also, the potential of leapfrogging legislation around can get confusing for the public. And when we're trying to be as transparent as possible in this virtual situation, that I feel pretty strongly that we should respect kind of maintaining that normal process as possible.
John, for the public, this references a 60-day provision, or Councilmember Murphy, you want to explain that?
The charter includes a provision that if the Planning Commission has not acted on a zoning bill after it has been referred to them, then it automatically becomes approved by the council. or I'm sorry, it's automatically deemed approved by the commission and the council can move forward.
So in that regard, this is probably something that's important to have in there. John, off the top of your head, do you know how many pieces of legislation that we bumped from April to May, public hearing?
I don't know the number, but it was a lot. Yeah.
So is everybody good with keeping that in there? I think it is important then to ensure inclusion, transparency, and that nothing moves forward until people have had that strong opportunity to give input on zoning legislation.
Yeah, I can't imagine a district council member objecting to that. And I mean, I'll be honest, I had a brief conversation with the vice mayor about this, but I fully anticipate that whenever we are back to normal public hearings and in-chamber meetings, that there will be a period where we are probably doing public hearings every meeting just to work through the backlog.
Which is a good segue. Councilmember Porterfield, your hand is up. Did I miss you? I'm sorry.
My apologies. I did not put my hand down from earlier. Please forgive me.
Okay, no worries. Well, that's an excellent segue, Councilmember O'Connell, to the next section, which is, I think, a very pragmatic potential solution going forward, as we've already taken 1 month of public hearings and moved them to May. So section D2 states that also in consultation with the planning department director, Lucy Kemp, depending on the amount of zoning legislation that gets backlogged for public hearing at the council, the rule should, maybe it just should be changed to could. The rule should or could be suspended to schedule a public hearing at each meeting to allow spacing out of the public hearings among agendas once we start meeting again in person. And so for the public, what this would mean is it does nobody any good service to have public hearings that will go in late into the night. If we're going to have public hearings that are so backlogged that they're going to take us to midnight, well, that doesn't do the public a service of ensuring open and equal opportunity for input and giving your testimony for a public hearing. So one potential solution is, once we get back to meeting as normal, is that we start spacing them out so that we aren't as backlogged. I think that's an excellent suggestion of what we could potentially do to clean up the backlog. We'll obviously have to talk about ensuring there's plenty of notice about that and whatnot.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to include any of that content in this letter.
Yeah. Well, that concludes the suggestions. I think we've gone through all of them. We've done a good bit of cleanup here. Anything else from folks? John?
Mr. Chair, I will take the document and make some of these edits and then send it around to the subcommittee this evening.
Very good.
And Mr. Chair, I guess I would ask you as a member, are you, as chair of the subcommittee, are you feeling that with Mr. Cooper's edits provisionally that the letter is appropriate for distribution to the executive committee?
I believe so. John, why don't you go ahead and send it to, I guess, to us, to this committee to take a final look at based on the edits. And if you want to go ahead and include the vice mayor on that, that's fine as well. And
will do.
Well, yeah.
Chair, I want to say thank you for chairing the committee, but also thank you to Councilwoman Murphy for all the work that she put into this. I think that this was very thoughtful, and looking at all of the different resources that she included and the references, I think it's very evident that she put a lot of time into this. So thank you to Councilwoman Murphy for leading the charge on getting this letter drafted.
Agreed. Well done, and thank you. All right. Anybody else? Councilmember Rosenberg?
Yeah, thank you all very much. Everybody who's put so much time into doing this, I think this is really important, and everybody did really good work. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie and ITS for guiding us through. And I hope to see everybody soon.
Hope so too.
All right. Take care.
Right.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.org.